IGN put out an article this past week stating that Resident Evil 5 is a game that cannot be remade in 2024. If they're echoing the argument that was made back in 2009, I have a strong suspicion what their argument is going to be. And in my opinion, they're not defending the people that they think they're defending. Rather, they're saying those people can't handle being the victims in a very unfortunate and very tragic story that could happen to any human on the planet, myself and you included. So I was going to read the article to you, but apparently they actually made a video on it as well. So for your viewing pleasure, let's watch the video together.
With Resident Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. But as the game's post-credit scene suggests, the remakes aren't over. And so the big question...
It's probably going to be Resident Evil 5. I've stated that in another video on this YouTube channel that you can find. But more than likely, I wish it was going to be Code Veronica, but more than likely, it's going to be Resident Evil 5.
Is where next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5, but on the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade, at least not to the standards of Capcom's best work, and so the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite.
I already don't agree with this because, I mean, we'll see what they have to say about rewriting, but you could very much take the gameplay of Resident Evil 5 and do what they did with Resident Evil 4, where you still kind of have the linear chapter struggle, but you open up the areas to, I'll use the word or the term open world. It's probably not the best way to describe it, but it's like open world areas within small individual worlds, if that makes any sense. You can 100% do that with Resident Evil 5, and it would make it a much better game compared to how linear this game is. With each progression from Resident Evil 4 to 5 and 6, they just got more and more linear, and they can definitely go back and expand on this like they did with Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil is a survival horror series. Not that you'd know that playing Resident Evil 5. Sure,
Fair.
It features a
Fair.
constant flow of horrific imagery, but Resident Evil 5 is an action game through and through. That's evident in its cover shooter mechanics, vehicle chases with on-rails turret sequences, and the constant rattle of assault rifles.
This is when Call of Duty was really getting big, so this is why a lot of these game franchises, including Resident Evil, started leaving survival horror behind and going to more action approaches because the action titles were doing so well. And it's why Resident Evil just went down and down and down until it revitalized itself with Resident Evil 7.
Even its visual design evokes the sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s. It all speaks to a series that had lost its way. Rather than reflect on the tenets that were the foundation of its experience, Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist in an attempt to find a new lease of life. The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty.
So I actually agree with all of that, yes.
As it sounds. This design appears to not just be a misguided attempt to follow Western successes, but also a misreading of its predecessor. With Resident Evil 4, director Shinji Mikami deftly reinvented the series through the use of a new over-the-shoulder camera angle. The perspective allowed for a more kinetic, action-heavy game. Despite this, Mikami never lost sight of the terror at the core of Resident Evil.
Yeah, the over-the-shoulder camera angle works great.
Placed to provide undulating waves of tension and fear,
I still love the fixed camera from the original Resident Evils, and it's why I'm looking forward to playing the new fixed camera mod for Resident Evil 2 Remake, which you'll eventually be able to catch on my other/new YouTube channel, Sergeant Fidget Plays, linked in the description down below. But the over-the-shoulder camera works really well for Resident Evil 4, 5, and even the 2 and 3 remakes. Well, and 4 remake as well.
Combat encounters were focused on surviving overwhelming horrors rather than dominating foes. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry. Their purpose is cannon fodder, a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels. And those levels are not locations to be explored. Instead, they are largely funnels that push you from entrance
so far I actually agree with all this.
Resident Evil 4 4 may have replaced the series' traditional continuous structure with discrete levels in an attempt to move away from the backtracking-heavy design of previous games, but it preserved the spirit of locations like the Raccoon City police station. The village, Salazar's castle, and the island feature interlocking, explorable pathways that solidify these locations as authentic spaces rather than obstacle courses.
That's what I'm saying. You can still have the same story and locations in a Resident Evil 5 remake, but just expand them into areas like this, and you can even combine certain levels, areas together to be one big area to explore and backtrack. You can definitely update the gameplay like they did with the Resident Evil 4 remake and make Resident Evil 5 a really great game.
Resident Evil 5 has no interest in this, with the majority of its stages being little more than corridors peppered with dead ends to hide treasures in. Their lack of authenticity means no one will ever mention the Kajuju Autonomous Zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. All this is to say that a faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling that the series' reset point, Resident Evil 7, was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew ever larger as you unlocked new rooms by solving its puzzles. Clever reinventions of this base conceit is the key to Resident Evil.
All these remakes in 7 and 8 are great games.
An unstoppable force into the house.
I still like Resident Evil Village, but even Resident Evil Village, in my opinion, started to go back towards the more action focus of 5 and 6. I've heard, I don't know if there's any truth behind this, I heard it's because there was complaints that Resident Evil 7 was too scary. What? So I'm hoping that when they get to eventually Resident Evil 9, we do get some more horror, and then they're not going to go back down the full-on action route again, especially considering how popular 2 and 4 remakes were, and 3 remake is like
house's corridors, such as Resident Evil 2's Mr. X, or expanding the scope of the house. Resident Evil Village's titular location is effectively a giant manor. Its corridors are streets, and its rooms are houses. Resident Evil 5's stage-driven structure is simply inferior to this design.
I thought he was going to do that out himself.
Recreation of it would only further highlight its flaws, especially coming in such close proximity to masterclasses like the remake of Resident Evil 2.
Yeah, like all these sections could be taken out or reworked.
The structure of their source material. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is
I want to play this so bad.
Version of the classic RPG, but its world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997 original. And so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake. A whole new environmental structure and scenario design.
I don't necessarily agree. I think
horror would bring it in.
I think Code Veronica needs it more because Resident Evil 5, its current version, is a more accessible game that's available on every console and multiple PC platforms today. You can get it cheap for old consoles in like used game stores or whatever. Code Veronica, you need older consoles like the Dreamcast, or I believe it was the PS3, could be PS2, but I think it was PS3. Yeah, PS3, and then the GameCube. Otherwise, it's not an easy game to track down. So a lot of people haven't played Code Veronica, which a lot of people should, because it gives a lot of back history to Chris and Wesker, which is why, again, I think it should come out before a Resident Evil 5 remake, because it will give people background for what their rivalry is with the culmination of Resident Evil 5. And what do I know? I'm just a nerd.
With Capcom's other remakes. But all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem: racism.
I knew it. I knew that's where they were gonna go with this. Okay, let me just, let's just play it.
Set in a fictional West African country, Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are black people. Yes, it's technically the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting, but the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection. Intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positions Africa as the Dark Continent, an uncivilized world harboring a diseased population that needs gunning down via Western intervention.
At no point playing this back in 2009 did I leave this game thinking Africa as a whole was a violent, terrible country with awful people. At no point did that enter my brain. Even now, how many years later? 15 years later? I still don't think that. And I have replayed this game countless times. Sorry, I said I was going to let them go on.
In the name of global security. This insensitive treatment of people of colour was hotly debated even as early as Resident Evil 5's debut trailer, with writers such as Ngai Kroll and Stephen Totillo pointing out the game's uncomfortable post-colonial imagery. The arguments and think pieces continued well into the game's release window, with IGN's own former editor-in-chief Hilary Goldstein having also wrestled with the subject. But that was 2009, a time when race was apparently a debate rather than a reality. In the 2020s, in a post-Black Lives Matter world, there is only one acceptable response to a white man shooting waves of Africans for an entire video game. No.
I'm trying to let them do their thing. I'm trying not to cut it off.
I have a job to do, and I'm gonna see it through.
Remakes may be able to redefine their source material, but there's only so many changes you can make until it's not a remake at all, but an entirely new game. And if you take Africa out of Resident Evil 5, is it Resident Evil 5 anymore? Even with a vastly improved, more sensitive take on the continent, perhaps one with a black protagonist and a more empathetic look at the outbreak, the experience would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5. So where does Capcom go now? Personally, I'd look backwards. Code Veronica is an ideal candidate, as is the original Resident Evil. But if the only way is chronologically forward, then a total rewrite of what comes next is the logical path. Because what followed Resident Evil 4 was not one terrible game, but two. Resident Evil 6 tripled down on the action-packed, set-piece heavy shooter
hate
design,
this game
to the extent that much
so
of it could
much.
be mistaken for a third-person Call of Duty spin-off.
I
were it
hate
not for
this
the
game.
monsters. Its restrictive level
I
design
love
practically
Resident
puts you in
Evil,
a chokehold,
but I
forcing you
hate
to
this
endure
game.
a barrage of bombastic moments that have no interest in evoking any sense of fear. Resident Evil 6 is a survival horror, only in that it's
Okay, are they done talking about Resident Evil 5?
Playing. But this time around, it doesn't have to be like that. Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline.
Okay.
In Resident Evil 4 Remake's post-credit scene, evil mastermind Albert Wesker details his plans for world domination to Ada Wong. Reflected in his glasses,
which is why we think we're getting Resident Evil 5 next.
is an image of Excella Gion and the Stairway of the Sun, two significant plot elements from Resident Evil 5, which indicates Capcom's intentions. But there's more to consider. This scene is largely a replication of the sequence from Assignment Ada, a non-canon chapter from the original Resident Evil 4. Its shift from unofficial to canon points to a willingness to change. Furthermore, the end of this scene is completely rewritten. When learning of Wesker's plans, rather than dutifully deliver the stolen Las Plagas sample to him, Ada betrays her shadowy boss and forces her helicopter to turn around. In this moment, the future of Resident Evil becomes unclear. Capcom has given itself the freedom to do whatever it wants. I just hope it's not a remake of Resident Evil 5.
Okay, so this is obviously going to be a hot, controversial, potentially sensitive subject for people. So before I get into my argument, let me at least say this. I am always open to having my opinion changed, being educated if maybe I'm looking at something through a very small or kind of obscure scope. So if you don't agree with me, by all means, in a respectful way, let me know in the comments down below. I am not against having my opinion changed and broadening my horizon. However, with that being said, I don't feel I'm off base here. The whole thing with like a virus or a bioweapon is that it doesn't care if what race you are, what gender you are, where you live, what your history is. A virus or a bioweapon looks at all people of all nationality, all genders as the same thing. Targets. It doesn't matter your race or the color of your skin to the virus. It just wants to infect and spread. I forget, it's been a while since I've played Resident Evil 5, but I believe there is a reason like the Ouroboros is based in Africa, which is why Wesker had to go there specifically, opposed to it taking place somewhere else in the world. Again, correct me if I'm wrong about that in the comments down below. but at no point in the game is Wesker's intention to target any specific race. He's not creating this weapon to destroy a certain race or a certain culture, or take advantage of a certain race or culture, weaponize a certain race or culture. His whole goal is world domination, including destroying everyone. If anything, I feel basing it over there expands the scope of Resident Evil's story besides just white people in America, which is where the first 3 games take place. In Resident Evil 6, I can't believe I'm referencing this game, but in the clips I think we just saw, do they not go to China at one point in the game? I'm pretty sure they do. Yeah, I know they do. So in Resident Evil 6, is it now racist that you're probably shooting zombies or whatever you want to call them that are of Chinese descent but have been infected by this bioweapon? No, because once again, it's not about like specifically targeting that race or that culture. That's just where the virus has spread, and it doesn't matter if you're a white person, black person, Chinese person. If you get inflicted with the Ouroboros virus or the T virus or whatever, you're just going to turn into some sort of monster. That happens to everyone on an equal level. So how is just trying to tell the story of another race or another culture being afflicted by this terrible virus racist towards them? I'm sorry, I feel like this gets thrown around a lot, and again, let me know if I'm looking at this the wrong way. By all means, educate me. I have no problem admitting I'm wrong, but this just feels like virtue signaling. There's nothing wrong with including a wide spectrum of people or multiple cultures in an overarching story, because it shows that we as humans are all in this together, and that we are all affected together by viruses and bioweapons. I mean, we just lived through a pandemic a couple years ago that affected everyone. It didn't target specific people. So I don't understand why IGN is bringing this conversation that remaking Resident Evil 5 is racist. It's in my opinion, or my perspective, it's including the people of Africa in a story that could very well happen in the US, Canada, Germany, wherever. This story could happen anywhere. In terms of the lore, again, I think the Ouroboros is based in Africa, which is why the story takes place there. But at no point, even Wesker in all of his evilness is attacking any specific human race or gender or culture. He just wants to murder all of us together equally. And isn't that a beautiful thing? Let me know in the comments section down below, and thanks for watching.